It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's Fireside chat called Building the Bio-Based Economy. As we stand at the intersection of sustainability, which Dr. Flood was so eloquent about, we are also in need of innovation and resilience. And what you might not know, friends, is biology is emerging as one of the most powerful tools we have in our decarbonization toolkit. I imagine you're here because you care about that, and if you're leaving, you should stay, because this is going to be really, really cool. So from bio-based plastics that replace petroleum and oil, to biopolymers that can rival polyester in textiles, to bacteria that can help extract minerals without toxic chemicals, biology is reshaping how we produce, manufacture, and build. In agriculture, biologicals are helping reduce dependence on chemical inputs. In food, enzymes and benign microbes are replacing artificial additives, improving health outcomes and sustainability. At the heart of this new economy are microorganisms, especially bacteria and enzymes. These are the workhorses of the bio-based revolution, and I never thought I would call bacteria and enzymes workhorses, but they are, and many of them are grown through precision fermentation, a process kind of like brewing beer. And today, it's largely done in stainless steel vats using corn as feedstock, and researchers are exploring new inputs and innovations that could expand and accelerate these processes. These guys are going to talk about that. Still, we've got some big questions on the horizon. How do we scale the technologies I just talked about? Wind and solar benefited from early aggressive policies. In Germany, they had the Renewable Energy Act. What is it going to take for textiles made from biopolymers to scale and compete with legacy materials like polyester? Will countries use sticks like a polyester tax or carrots like large subsidies to help this sector grow? These are the kind of challenges these gentlemen I'm about to introduce are going to unpack on stage today. And it's worth noting that in response to concerns that the U.S. was falling behind in this space, DARPA launched BioMADE, signaling just how strategic and urgent this sector has become for national competitiveness. So today, we're fortunate to hear from some gurus, some leaders who are shaping the future of the bioeconomy. Each bring a unique lens to this fast-evolving space. Doug Friedman, come on up, gentlemen, as I introduce you, is CEO of BioMADE, a leading public-private sector partnership to advance U.S. leadership in bioindustrial manufacturing. Welcome, Doug. Mike Luciani, co-founder and managing partner at Juniper, an investment firm focused on scaling innovative bio-based technologies. Michael Clear, science associate at Schmidt Sciences, a research-driven initiative investing in the frontier of science and tech. And guiding our conversation today is Bill Bullock, Senior Vice President of Economic and Statewide Development at the North Carolina Biotechnology Center, a key player in advancing life sciences innovation and economic impact. Together, these gentlemen are going to explore how to scale, finance, and support the transition to a bio-based future, what it'll take for biology to truly compete at the scale of petrochemicals, plastics, and traditional manufacturing. With that, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Bill, who's going to take it away. Thanks, gentlemen.
Very good. Can you all hear me? Awesome. Thanks, Molly. Glad you all stayed. For the people that left, they will miss out, but all of you who came in, smart move. Again, I'm Bill Bullock. I'm the Senior Vice President for Economic and Statewide Development at the North Carolina Biotechnology Center. We are a primarily state-funded organization here in North Carolina to help build the ecosystem for biotechnology to thrive. We've been around 40 years, and while I'd love to tell you everything about it, that's not what we're here for. But if you're sitting there thinking, gosh, Bill, please tell us more about the Biotech Center. If you're with the Biotech Center, raise your hand and you can ask one of those folks. So we've got Megan and Susan and I think Jen out here. So what we are here to talk about is building the bio-based economy. So we have three great folks to help us do that. We don't have a lot of time to do it, so I'm going to jump in right now, and I'm going to ask each of them, you got a quick introduction there, remind them which one you are and who you're with and why you're here. So Doug, I'm going to start with you.
Thanks, Bill. And it's great to be back. I was here last year and had such a great time. I'm joining you again. So I'm Doug Friedman. I'm the CEO of BioMADE. BioMADE is a nonprofit public-private partnership that was established in 2020, right at the tail end of the last Trump administration by the Department of Defense, to really drive the scale-up of bioindustrial manufacturing. I'm just going to unpack a lot of what I just said very, very briefly before handing it back to Bill. So scale up, what are we talking about with scale up? We just heard a talk that was really focused on manufacturing. It's really this idea that we have in the United States invested tens of billions of dollars, and that's probably a slight underestimate, in modern biotechnology. What we have not done so well is scale modern biotechnology to the point of manufacturing industrial products across a wide range of applications at a scale that is relevant. We do it pretty well in the pharmaceutical industry. There are a handful of classes of molecules that we do in the industrials, but we've really only scratched the surface. So how do we drive scale-up innovation to advance to economic benefit? I also said we're a public-private partnership. What that means is that we work with the public sector. For us, that's the federal government, primarily through the Department of Defense, but really across the interagency to coordinate and catalyze that type of scale-up work that we discussed. I think the last thing I'll say is that we, before turning it back to Bill, is that we are also a nonprofit consortium, and so our job is really to be the conduit between the federal government and the private sector. So that's the private part. We do that through a group of now 330 members, largely companies, but includes academic institutions, nonprofit agencies, the NC Biotech Center, for example, across 39 states. And so we're a nationally focused organization that tries to drive this type of work, and I'm happy to be here with my colleagues once again.
Outstanding, Doug, thank you. Okay, we have two Michaels, so I have Michael L. and Michael C., so that's what we're doing today. So Michael L., tell us a little bit about Juniper.
Yeah, my pleasure. I think my microphone is working. Yeah? Awesome. So I'm Michael. I'm one of the co-founders and kind of managing partners of Juniper. Juniper is an early stage venture capital firm, and we are entirely focused on bioindustrials. So I suppose I am our representative from the private sector on the stage here today. And kind of some fun facts for those who may not be familiar with this area. The bioeconomy and bioengineering, often, people hear these words and they think about pharmaceuticals, but pharmaceuticals represent less than half of the total bioeconomy. The other big segments are industrials, how we make physical goods, as well as food and ag. And actually, up to about 60% of all of the physical inputs to the global economy can be made via biomanufacturing. So that's kind of the scale of the opportunity where we could make many, many things today that we derive from petrochemicals primarily, hopefully in a way that's not only more sustainable, but also more efficient as the biomanufacturing sector matures. So my firm, we invest in companies that are doing that.
Good. Michael?
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. So my name is Michael Clear. I'm a science associate at Schmidt Sciences. And so Schmidt Sciences is a really new organization. We were founded by Eric and Wendy Schmidt. We were previously Schmidt Futures. And Schmidt Sciences focuses on a number of different areas, not just within the bioeconomy. So just for awareness, I'll let you know that we focus on AI and software engineering. We also do climate work. We do astro and space work, as well as science systems. But I'm a member of our biosciences team, and our biosciences team was actually born out of a task force report that was done it started in 2021 and was released in April of 2022. And the goal of that task force was to bring people from former regulators to those in industry to the academics to try to see, what are the challenges to creating a resilient, circular U.S. bioeconomy, and what needs to be done to, kind of make the most of these, this bio-based economy. And then so from that, for our biosciences group, we distilled down, what are things that are actionable for a philanthropy? And so for us, we're really interested in things that we can push the needle on a 5-year timescale and not focus on areas that people like Doug and Michael are already focusing on. What are the problems that are getting overlooked? And so that's part of my role, is identifying those program areas and then funding those projects.
Great intros, guys, and concise and beautiful, so keeping us on track. Michael C., I'm going to stay with you. So you're with a program called BioFutures at Schmidt Sciences. Can you talk a little bit more specifically about what that program looks like and some of the areas of emphasis on the biotech and bioeconomy side that you guys are looking at?
Yeah, perfect. And I think so when we were part of Schmidt Futures, we started off as being the BioFutures program. And in February of last year, so a little over a year ago, we shifted to Schmidt Sciences. And so now we've broadened our purview to biosciences. But first, I'll start with BioFutures. So with BioFutures, we were focused on problems of science of scale within industrial biomanufacturing. And for us, that meant anything that's not touching biomedical. And with our early BioFutures program, we were primarily focused on creating new types of really kind of platform technology, really hardware focused. And so actually, our first big award was in partnership with BioMADE, where we wanted people to rethink how bioreactors are done. So moving beyond just the classic fermenters that you might see in a brewery, thinking more creatively about scale-up challenges as well as downstream processing challenges. We also have a program that's still actively going on that's related to developing new sensors to probe the health of microorganisms in bioreactors. The idea of this is, can you actually plug something into a bioreactor that actually tell you how it's performing beyond just some basic metrics like pH and dissolved oxygens? But as we've shifted, so that was BioFutures days, now we've kind of graduated, we've gone on to biosciences, we're still very interested in science of scale, but we're broadening it out to think about more fundamental biology questions. And for us, that's often in the context of industrial biomanufacturing. How do we get a better understanding of the sources of heterogeneity and the complexity and variability that we see in biological systems? And so we're actively exploring different areas as it relates to that now, and maybe happy to chat more about that.
Great. I'm going to stay on that theme. Doug, this idea of scaling, I mean, this is really kind of what you all are all about. So maybe talk a little bit more about that in the context of BioMADE and what you and I were chatting a little bit about. Why DoD? Why is DoD the agency that funded something like BioMADE?
Yeah, thanks. So I will zoom out quite a lot and talk a little bit about supply chains, because that's ultimately what we're talking about. If we ignore the bio part, and this is a little bit what Bill and I were talking about early on, I promise this is still the bio panel, but just bear with me. If we ignore the bio part for a minute and simply, big simple air quotes, simply think about what stuff is made from that we need and use. Stuff is made from mostly petroleum-based chemicals and mining. If you trace it all the way back, that's where you're getting your atoms. If you look at today's global chemical supply chain, what you find is a fragmented and, frankly, quite dangerous set of supply movements that make for a really fragile early chemical supply chain. So the U.S. imports the vast majority of its commodity chemicals. It's interesting here at the Cleantech conference, starting to, hearing a lot about energy production and the movement of energy production. Right? A lot of the commodity and specialty chemicals we use come as byproducts from the energy industry, right? We know that. As the energy industry evolves and looking at the import of global chemical supply, inevitably, what is going to happen is we are going to see constrained chemical supply in the U.S. And so from BioMADE's perspective, the question is, well, what do you do about it? Well, really the only choice is to start to onshore a broader set of industrial chemical manufacturing and find enough carbon to be able to manufacture all of the chemicals and materials that we need. Where are you going to find the carbon? Where is it going to come from? especially with the movements that we see in the energy industry. That's where you get to biology. You're going to get the carbon largely from agriculture. Agriculture, for starters, is biology. But then you start to think about what are you going to do with some of the major agricultural products we have in the United States? Corn, the corn stover, sugar beets, etc. Well, ultimately you can convert that into sugars that then Molly, as was presenting, can be eaten by microbes. And microbes really just make stuff. Naturally, some microbes make alcohol, which is how we get to the brewery examples and wine and distilled spirits and everything else. I'll come back to distilled spirits in a minute, I promise. And that is the fundamental core of industrial biomanufacturing and the core of what BioMADE cares about. How do we get to a point where we can manufacture a sufficient diversity of commodity and specialty chemicals domestically to build a secure United States supply chain of chemicals and materials? And the only way that's going to happen is one, with biology, and two, with scaling a whole lot of companies, which is why I'm really glad Michael is here. And BioMADE is there to enable that core tenet. I told you I was going to come back to distilled spirits. I will, and then I'll give it back to Bill for a minute. We talk a lot about fermentation, right? Fermentation came up many times in the opening remarks. Michael in the Schmidt Sciences program, which was then Schmidt Futures, that funded an effort through BioMADE, was on a fermentation program. Thank you again for that. But fermentation is not the end of the game for the manufacture of chemicals and materials. You also have to think about purifying a fermented material to get to a single chemical or material that you ultimately want to put out. And that is called, in the industry, downstream processing. It's called in all manufacturing industries, downstream processing. It turns out that we as a country have been underinvesting in downstream processing technologies for industrial biomanufacturing for approximately ever. We've never really engaged in that topic. And so thinking about the whole life cycle from an idea to a feedstock, to an industrial scale fermentation system, to an industrial scale downstream processing system, into a feed to the broader chemical supply chain, and doing so in a way that is economically viable for commodities, meaning your margin stinks, is a super hard problem. And that ultimately is the problem that BioMADE is working to solve. And depending on how much time we have, we can cover a bunch of specific aspects of how BioMADE is working to solve some of those problems. But I try to get my core message in early in these types of panels. The core message is that to do that, it takes an all hands on deck approach, and it takes basically everyone. And it's one of the reasons I like coming to events like this, because we hear from, for example, and I brought this up already, all of these energy speakers, right? As the energy market moves, understanding both how that is going to impact industrial biomanufacturing and how industrial biomanufacturing can help solve problems related to global energy movements and domestic energy movements is a really important part of putting together this complex puzzle. And these are the types of things that are ultimately going to give the United States a global competitive advantage as the bioindustrials market is ultimately waiting for some country to take hold and drive it forward.
Just that. That's all. That's all we got to do. Okay, so Michael L., I'm going to throw you into this mix, all right? So Doug has talked about this process, this translation of innovation to commercial product, and the scaling challenges. They're everywhere, but particularly in the bio-based economy space. Building emerging companies in any space is hard. Give us your perspective on where we are right now in the emerging company space around synbio and bio-based companies, early stage challenges, unique to the time, not unique to the time. Just lend your perspective.
Yeah, I think that we are pretty early. When I kind of gave my stat in the beginning of the talk about how 60% of all the physical inputs to the global economy could be made with engineered biology, we are less than 10% kind of that 60. So there's still a vast majority of work ahead of us. I kind of think that if we are analogizing to maybe the internet or the computer era, we're looking to a point right now where we are just kind of having personal computers be something that could be in everyone's home. And you're talking to people about it and they think it sounds a little wild. They're like, I don't know if we're ever gonna have computers in everyone's home. I think over the next 20 years, we will see an analogous explosion of growth in this sector. And it's driven by the same trends that drove the internet and the computing industry's growth, which is a very rapidly declining cost curve. At a certain point in time, if you wanted to work with computers, you needed a room this size full of giant machines with blinking lights that you were like feeding cards into. And so that was a lot of upfront costs. Not very many people could do that. And as the cost went down, the personal computer was popularized. People on the internet for low cost could kind of teach themselves how to code or interact with software. And it became cheaper and cheaper for companies to form. And as companies formed, they solved a whole host of different problems that the vast majority of people had not even thought about, let alone thought were worth solving. And the cost curve that we think about a lot for biology is the cost to read, write, and edit DNA. How do you ask, in the case of fermentation where you're using microbes, how do you ask the microbes to make the stuff you want? You do it by editing their genome, their code base. And today you can do that, at least for the example of reading the code base, for a couple $100. Takes a relatively short amount of time. It's very standardized. 20 years ago, that was a multi-billion-dollar effort, right? So the cost curve going down means that people can, for a couple $100, try something today that wasn't possible for them to try maybe just 10 years ago. So that's kind of the very big picture window into this. I think in the more tactical sense, the world I'm a part of, the venture capital world, if you pay attention at all to venture investing, there is something of a shift underway where more and more investors are focused on the physical world, right? It used to be 10 years ago, if you were a venture capitalist, you were doing one thing, and that thing was software, maybe even just like iPhone apps, Whereas today, companies like Colossal Biosciences or SpaceX are inspiring investors to say, holy crap, you can make a lot of money investing in physical world technologies. And even companies like Anduril in the defense space are meeting societal needs where people are saying, we really need to reindustrialize. And so I think that the private capital stack is learning how to wrap its head around the idea that we can finance factories and we can finance CapEx and manufacturing plants, and that can still be good business. And so I think that is a huge barrier that is being overcome more broadly than just within bio, but has big implications for bioindustrials as much as anything else.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. Michael Clear, you just heard all that. So we're, from a Schmidt Sciences perspective, where do we need to be putting more funding? What are you funding in the research space that give a few examples that's going to enable everything that we just heard?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I think I heard most of that. And I will actually push back just a tiny bit. I think on one of the first things you said, I think you'd said it's like we're young industry. And I do think it's early days. I think I agree with the overall sentiment, but I do think what's really interesting and something we've been thinking about a lot is it's not that young of an industry. I think we have examples of a lot of companies that have maybe gone past one valley of death and maybe failed later on. And we've had a lot of companies that failed in those early stages. And so one thing that we're really thinking about is there's a lot of resources, a lot of venture capital resources, a lot of government funding resources that are going into trying to scale really fantastic ideas. And then when they fail, that data is lost. And so I think we're thinking a lot about, is there a way that some of that data can be captured either that's, on companies that have failed, which is a really challenging problem, or is there a way that we can start to think about how we're standardizing our experiments, standardizing our data, at least in industrial biomanufacturing space, that can then be leveraged for something that's the bigger, greater good. And I also think, BioMADE is also working, has an effort that they're working on in a similar space. But that kind of gets to one of those, like I mentioned, we're very interested in the science of scale. And one of the big challenges with science of scale is the predictability of your microorganisms. So typically, I would say the US is really, really good at this point, like you said, at genetically engineering an organism to do something really well in a flask. But the moment you try to put that into a larger bioreactor, the environment changes and those efficiencies go down. And trying to understand why one bioreactor actually had really amazing efficiency, but the other one run under the exact same conditions makes it really challenging to scale businesses. And so, what are we missing there? Why does it seem like it's voodoo when we're trying to run all of these different experiments? And so one example is thinking about, how can we capture data better? How can we leverage data that's already existing? Another program that we're exploring right now is we're trying to very carefully venture into this AI and bio space, but we know that there's a lot of people focusing on, a handful of problems, like something like protein folding, reaction kinetics. That's something that we're not hyper focused on, but we do think there are some areas where there are some computational tools that haven't yet been leveraged for either pre-existing biological data sets, or maybe, there should be some resources put to generating new biological data sets. And so that's something we're excited about. We think there's a lot of potential there. And I would just say broadly, I think there's, as part of Schmidt Sciences, I get a chance to talk to a lot of really brilliant scientists. We have a polymaths program, and these are typically people that are really gifted chemists or physicists. And I'm really excited by whenever I get to talk to them, they're so excited to talk about biology. I think everyone's kind of waking up to the excitement of the bio-based economy. And so I think in order to really make this work, we need to get people that aren't necessarily biologists coming and trying to help tackle some of these problems. And so we're also interested in this interdisciplinary work that could happen. How can we make physics work better for biologists? Is how we think about things sometimes.
Fantastic. We've got 50 more questions and we have like 10 minutes. So I'm gonna skip to the end because this is probably what kind of everybody wants to know right now. So I'm gonna ask, you all are gonna respond to this. Michael, why don't you start? So given where we are today, and actually I've been writing words down throughout the course of the day of how people are describing the current environment we're in, tumultuous, turbulent, were a couple that I noted that were said earlier. The environment we're in today, give me your perspective from where you are at Schmidt Sciences about where we are, and leave us, before we take some questions, with a point of optimism around the bio-based economy from your perspective.
I really don't want to have to start this one, but I'll go ahead and give it a go. I will say with the caveat of we're very well aware, working at a philanthropy, we're somewhat insulated to some of the other challenges that you get if you're relying on federal funding, local funding, something like that. But one thing, because we are trying to find areas to fund that others aren't already funding, I thought I would be able to talk to some of our friends at the DoD, the DOE, or those that were receiving funding, and talk to them and say, are you finding that you're not funding things in the industrial biomanufacturing space? And so far, that's the answer is still not yet clear. But I would say when we're focused on biology for applied purposes and those of biomanufacturing, it hasn't appeared as gloomy as other maybe more climate-focused initiatives. And so I do think, if you're a researcher that's really good at fundamental biology work, fundamental chemistry work, if you make it more application-focused, it seems that there might be some viability there. And I am excited about that. And I maybe jumped too early on my previous statement, but I am really excited about, these are rapidly moving computational techniques, and that there is some growing excitement about biology. I really believe deeply that we need to be talking to more people outside of the biological discipline, and I do see that as a continuing trend.
Michael.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that to Michael Clear's point, I think you can also make a good argument that we are in an era that feels like the early 2000s as it relates to the internet, right? Like there's been a wave of biotech 1.0. Some have succeeded, many did not. Capacity has increased a great deal. There's a lot that has been learned and learnings that need to be captured. And the time for really inspiring generational companies to be built is happening right now, right? Those companies have already been started. They're just in their early days. And so I think you could make an equally good argument for that analogy. I think you can also say, we've been fermenting things longer than humans have been doing most things. So, it's one of the oldest industries out there. As far as where we are now, I think my first thought goes to the political reality. And when I started Juniper, we talked a lot about climate, and we see a really strong story and a really strong impact for sustainability in the work that we do and the work that our companies do. We talk less about climate now in our work, not because the impact has changed, but because the political discourse has changed. However, I do think that there's just as much energy in the space, and there's just as much political will, and maybe Doug will correct me, or he knows more about it than I do, I'm sure. But it seems like I hope, there's just as much political will to fund and support these types of programs. But the logic behind it is much more about, bringing next-gen manufacturing jobs onshore in America, supply chain resiliency, and kind of being a winner in a global geopolitical technology arms race. And I think that from my perspective, all of these reasons are important, and it doesn't bother me to emphasize one over another as long as this work is getting done. And it absolutely is. I think the last kind of point that I get excited about for this moment in time is the increasing potential of AI, machine learning, and the other disciplines kind of intersecting more and more with biology. The fact that researchers can use these AI applications to model what they're doing in silico without having to necessarily, run 100 different tests in 100 different petri dishes where they're trying to engineer 100 different organisms, but they can use predictive analysis and they can use AI to say, great, like we have fed a lot of data into the system. It's given us a high confidence that these are probably the top 5 experiments we need to run to get the results that we want, is really exciting, because it just, again, is a step change in how quickly discoveries are made and advancements are made. And it's really, really exciting to see that play out in the space today.
Beautiful. All right, Doug Friedman, as you do so well in 2 minutes, bring us home.
Sure. Okay, so, Michael, I'm a physical organic chemist. And so I completely agree with you that we need to get people from a wide variety of technology areas and, frankly, business into this business, because that's how it's going to ultimately be successful. To sort of answer the core question, it is a challenging time right now. It's the reality of the world we live in. For BioMADE and for this industry, I think the challenge has been just around uncertainty. There's a lot moving really fast, and it's both hard to keep track of, and 2, you're not really sure what the broader direction is. On one hand, that happens every 2 or 4 years in the US. So there's some of that you just sometimes you forget and then you come back. And I'm not trying to imply that it's not different or the same. It's just sort of the reality. What I will say about bioindustrial manufacturing, both BioMADE and the industry at large, we have been working with bipartisan support from before the beginning. I spend an awful lot of time in Washington, D.C., on Capitol Hill, meeting with representatives and senators from all across the country, from all political stripes. And I have yet to have a meeting where someone says, well, that seems like a silly idea. Why are we doing that? And these are some people I know pretty well who have told me that about other things, so I know they're not just being nice. And to Michael's point, the reason I think that is true is twofold. One, this industry in particular is really good at just putting their heads down and getting to work. You've got to do the work and have the outcomes actually show what is possible. And it's not that all outcomes are good, but it shows what is possible. And at the same time, what is possible are a set of topics that have inherent support for a broad set of the population. I spent a long time talking about the fragility of supply chains. If you dig into that, that can be a discussion about jobs in rural parts of the country that have not historically seen the benefits of science and technology. You could talk about it in the context of competition with China, competition with many other countries. There are some products that can be made with biomanufacturing that have unique characteristics that solve major defense problems. It's part of why we exist. There are examples that show that we can support farming in rural communities. There are examples that show we can help mitigate the effects of climate change. We can talk about just about any area and tie it back to biomanufacturing, because of some of the reasons my colleagues brought up, is able to have a positive impact in all of those areas, and those are just facts. And we're demonstrating that today. And so what I've seen in the last 2 months, 4 months, 2 years, 5 years, has been that this same sentiment has run true and run through. And maybe the focus is going to change a little bit. Maybe how you talk about it to a larger group of people is going to change a little bit. Maybe the funding streams are going to change a little bit. All of that can be true. But at the end of the day, we've seen such strong bipartisan support in this area that I am not particularly concerned, as long as we in this industry keep our head down and show that we can actually accomplish things in this area. And again, it's one of the reasons I personally come to meetings like this, because I think doing that in an interconnected way with a lot of other research areas, companies from outside of the field, is going to be the way to demonstrate the broadest impact, and ultimately going to be good for industrial biomanufacturing and good for the country.
Thank you, Doug. Well said. The good news or the bad news? The good news is that we're done. The bad news is that we're done. I apologize if you had a burning question. Find one of these gentlemen out at the reception or another time, but we are at time, and I know people need to get off to 5 o'clock sessions. So if you would be so kind as to thank our great panelists.
Okay.